Hey everybody, welcome to the practice track before the actual shoot. I do apologize for this tutorial lesson or series taking very long time, but I want to make sure I could do it as best as I can because this is sort of like experimental in the aspect that I'm using not, expensive $30,000 or $60,000 anamorphic primes with PL mount and all that fun stuff. I'm doing the low budget version, which in my previous anamorphic videos you can see I'm talking about the fact that we're using spherical lenses attached to the Anamorph 50. If you're curious about that, you can spend $1,000 and see the link below. It's well worth it. So I'm using the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, shooting at either 4K DCP or 4K UHD. In this case, I'm using 4K DCP, which is a little bit wider. But this is eventually going to get squashed by 1.33. You can see right now, Rev is looking rather stretched. So again, I monitored it on set with an external monitor showing me the squash, but this is what you physically capture, and this is what you should be bringing in Nuke. I talked to a lot of guys in the industry in my interview show, and you can see them specifically chatting about the fact that when they get their anamorphic footage, when they get their plates are usually in the unsquashed version like this. So again, if you want this footage, I have it available at my store. Just look at the link below for VFXforFilmmakers.com. I think it's an online store where you can download these, and again, that's where I'm going to be providing these links and so forth. So here you can see we have a DPX sequence that I took off of DaVinci Resolve. That is just a 10-bit sequence. So when you get this footage, feel free to put in CG, remove stuff. I mean, there's so many things you can do with this. You can make a Blade Runner world. You can put skies or cities back here. I'm not going to keep you guys from taking this footage and putting it in your reel or helping your reel out. I think it'll be kind of exciting. You can remove Bed Bath & Beyond, show off, hey, I put in another neon sign, or do what Ridley Scott did, which again was basically retrofitting different, pieces in here. And again, I'll be going through the Maya workflow eventually, where we take footage like this and bring it into Maya, put some CG in it, bring it back into Nuke, and render it out. But again, as I talked about before with the Anamorph 50, which again it's voodoo tracking, what we're about to get into, and this is, Steve Wright has kind of warned me as the great godfather of VFX that he is, that you're dealing with something that the equations that are already preset inside of Nuke for tracking anamorphic footage have no idea what you're doing, because you're basically putting a spherical lens recording a anamorphic lens, but it still works. The only issues I've had, which we're going to talk about in further lessons, is making sure when you do the undistortion, because you got to get all the curved bow distortion out, that you get everything of it out, because it's not like spherical lenses. There's an asymmetry to the actual layout of the actual the lenses themselves. There are programs, PF Track and 3D Equalizer, that do this way more efficiently. Nuke is not specifically designed to do anamorphic tracking. It has anamorphic options, even from those programs, as far as the equations and algorithms. But ultimately, that sort of stuff is probably best either, footage can be corrected for any kind of like skew, inside of programs like 3D Equalizer. And again, Effects PhD, I believe, has lessons on 3D Equalizer. I believe they do. Don't quote me on that. So anyway, you can still get away with it if you're putting together a reel for your work. Spending $1,000 if you already have a rig on an anamorphic adapter such as the Anamorph 50, to me, is a great investment. It really brings things to life. I've been shooting it for the last 2 months, guys. I can't begin to tell you. I will never go back to spherical unless I'm doing just basic interview or just filming my nephews at their, baseball games or something. But if it really is absolutely amazing, and it just really makes everything feel. It's a flaw. It's a flawed reality. It was designed to get widescreen into theaters, but it just is ingrained in our brains as being very cinematic, especially the lens flares, which are just all artifacts. So anyway, again, we have the footage that is currently stretched at the current, there is no squashed version. I monitored the squashed version on set to make sure the framing was right, but you eventually, like all compositors, will bring in the actual footage unsquashed, and that's what it's going to look like here. Usually they're using with 2K CinemaScope or whatever formats. In this case, we're actually going the full 4K in this example. So get ready. So here is a checkerboard I printed out, and in my previous videos I have links to where you can download a JPEG of this, and I think I have it linked on my Patreon if I'm not mistaken. But you can download this, and I'll just go ahead and just play this through here. So let me put this to input, and you can kind of see what I did. Now, I actually decided I was going to reshoot this, but I decided to leave it because I want you guys to see this, and I want you to see the flaw from which I filmed this. I took my Steadicam rig, which is my Ronin M that had my Blackmagic Pocket 4K on it, with everything on it, the adapter, the lens I used on the day. So basically, right after I shot with Rev, I went up to this thing that was up on my bedroom wall, and I just simply recorded this right here. Okay, but the camera was, because the rig was set up a different, oddly, was tilted down, so it doesn't look like I'm looking straight on at my actual printed up checkerboard. It's actually pointing down. Now your camera should be perfectly perpendicular to the wall itself when you film this, and obviously when you record these checkerboards, you want to have them as flat as possible by really, pressing the tape. If you have tape, make sure it's strong tape and keep it really kind of tight along the edges. Don't have any wrinkles in here. But I'm going to show you what happens when you record with the camera slightly tilted down and moving in on here. You're going to see that it's going to require a lot more stretch or resampling with the redistort node, as opposed to just having it like dead on looking straight forward. So again, sometimes flaws are worth investigating, so you know when you see it, you go, oh my gosh, look what I did. It's not actually going to make anything look terrible, but it is something when it comes to you thinking about sampling and taking something, and you remember you're redistorting footage. You're taking it and warping it. The more you warp CG that you render, or warp anything you put out of a scanline render node, you're warping it more extreme if you have this circumstance. So just be aware of that. All right, so the first thing you're going to do is we need to get into anamorphic land. In this case, again, if you were shooting on, say, again, there's two different types of anamorphs. There's the Anamorph 50 with the two-time squeeze, which goes good for if you're using a full frame GH5S, or you have the Blackmagic, which obviously is a 16:9 aspect ratio type filming device. You want to get the 1.33 Anamorph 50. And that will give you a different type of squeeze. So if you recall from our previous lesson, I talked about how, in this case, in this circumstance we're doing right now, we're shooting 4096 by 2160. The aspect ratio is not going to be your typical Hollywood 235 aspect ratio. I know there's 239 and all that, but it's going to eventually get squashed to a 251. So we're not talking, the aspect ratio is going to be slightly more stretched or wider than your atypical Hollywood style aspect ratio in the circumstance we're doing with right now. It's not going to be the Hateful Eight, but again, it's not going to be the regular 235 aspect ratio here. So we're going to end up with a 251 aspect ratio when we film. Now, the footage I'm going to be shooting a little bit later, the real shoot, I'm going to probably be going with this solution, simply because my ND filter is actually cutting off at this aspect ratio. You're seeing a little bit of my ND filter. I have a 77 millimeter ND filter to cut out the light so I can get best shallow depth of field. The big fight with everything being so small, sensor size being small, lenses being small, is fighting for that very, very shallow depth of field when you're working in this anamorphic workflow. Now, that can be helped by the longer the lens, but when it comes to wide-angle lenses, that's going to be a lot of fun, but it's not really that big difference. It's a flaw, and like I talked about in my previous lessons, embrace the flaws, embrace your limitations, okay? So again, this is another aspect ratio, and again, if you're shooting with the Anamorph, if you got the 2x, again, you could only use the 2x with the Panasonic GH5S, from which you're going to get this from a nice 2x squeeze. Your anamorphic, your actual anamorphic lens flares will be a lot wider. Your bokeh will be a lot wider. In fact, you can kind of, just by looking at these shapes, you can get an idea of what your bokeh is going to look like. The out of focus little highlights in the background will look like this on the 1.33, which will look pretty good actually. But you'll have really nice ones when you get the GH5 S when you do 4.3. I'm currently recording this during SIGGRAPH, and there's also been announcements by Panasonic in regards to their newest models, and it's just crazy, guys. Technology is moving so fast. There's new cameras, new competitors, and you're going to see this stuff change around like again and again and again. So, okay, enough rambling. Let's get started here. All right, so what you're going to do is first create a format that is anamorphic. Now, the key to understand with the anamorphic footage is you are going to be working in square or rectangular aspect ratio pixels, but ultimately what's going on in the background will still remain square. So for instance, if I hit the letter S for settings, you have the full-size formats, and you can see we have the 4K DCP default here. You can't see it at the bottom of the screen, but I'm going to go to the word new, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to call this 4K DCP I'll do 1.33 Anamorph. Okay. So that format will be, and you can read it up here, right? 4096 by 2160. And if you want to down convert this to 2K, that's fine. 2K DCP, you can just do a write node really quick and write it out as another DPX if you feel that 4K is just too much for you, or at least maybe your computer's slow. So 4096 by 2160, and now my aspect ratio 1.33, or my pixel aspect ratio, boom, there you go. And now I'm going to hit OK. Now it doesn't actually show you the aspect ratio change. I talked about the different aspect ratio. It's not going to tell you that visibly, but now you can see we have the squash. Now, if at any one time you want to see what's going on with this, you could right click and just click on, again, you want to make sure in your project your properties bin nothing's in there, or at least just X out anything when you do this, but you want to right click and say ignore pixel aspect ratio. So you can see the difference there. And again, if I'm in this mode where I'm in this aspect ratio and I create a roto, okay, and I just create a ellipse, you can see I'm drawing it out like this, okay. I have the shape, but if I right click and I say enable, if I come over here, let's see here, and turn off enable, ignore pixel aspect ratio, you can see it's actually oval. Again, if I come over here and draw it in this aspect ratio, you get that. So again, you can see if I take this and do ignore aspect ratio, the changes. Now, if I'm in this kind of widescreen aspect ratio or square pixel aspect ratio, and I take an ellipse and I draw it, if I hold down Shift, you can see it's remaining oval because it's conforming to what is the proper perfectly spherical shape in the non-square aspect ratio. So if I draw out this ellipse, it looks oval, but if I go to the ignore pixel aspect ratio, you can see it's spherical. So you can see if I just go ahead and I'll turn that back. So just be aware of that when you're drawing out rotos in this world. Okay, now that we have done this, the computer is aware. Okay, just be aware that the computer at this point is aware that there's some form of anamorphic reality here, and that sort of information will be understood by the 3D tracker. Now the first thing we need to do is take out this distortion, and obviously with anamorphic, depending on the quality of your lenses and so forth, you'll get barrel lens distortion. Here you can see it's in an extreme look. This could be something artistic, but with, say, more of lenses with proper corrections, you can actually get this stuff out of here when you actually physically record it. But it depends on the quality of the lenses and so forth, and the build of the actual capture of the lenses, and so forth. So let's go over to this. Again, this is the same lens. You have to use the same exact lens. So my recommendation is after you film for a day, or maybe if you want to have this on set somewhere under a nice light or something, with a very solid boarding behind it so it's not, bending, Once you film a shot with your lens and all whatever you do, just immediately run over and just take the Steadicam or whatever and just slowly walk up to and back away from your actual checkerboard. That way you actually have, just some footage here. And again, this is going to be tracked to establish the lens distortion. And remember, this is anamorphic. So you're going to get a larger stretch horizontally than you would vertically. But the squish compensation is going to keep the squares perfectly square. So you can see it's like, it looks like things are perfectly square. But along the lines, you can see that these are more rectangle. See that? And again, if you just come up here, you're not seeing that too much, and not so much down here. But again, very heavily on the edges, because remember, you're recording this image on a cylinder, half of a cylinder, okay? And that's why you're getting this weird reality, and we have to keep that into account as we move forward in this process. So let's jump over and create a lens distortion node. All right, throw that in. Now, we are going to kind of let the computer analyze the image, and then we're going to feed whatever information we have here into a 3D tracker node. Okay, so I'll make a camera tracker node. So whatever information I have here, I'm actually going to throw this thing away eventually, but I'm going to take the information and feed it into the camera tracker to help it with the solve. All right, so let's first go over to the lens distortion node. It's currently set to ST map. We're not exporting ST maps at all, so we're going to leave this so that when the solve occurs, we're going to physically undistort the plate and remove the barrel lens curve distortion, which needs to happen because, as I talked about before, in the 3D realm, there is no curved barrel lens distortion. There is perspective distortion, but there is no barrel lens distortion. These are perfect straight perspective lines. All right, so let's come over here. I'm going to open up these distortion models, denominators, and all this fun stuff. And you can see the type, we're going to put this to anamorphic. Now, you'll see something change when you go from spherical to anamorphic. You'll see that the actual models change. The equations of the distortion equations actually change. You can see them right here. And, you're like, what's this all about? Equation, da-da-da-da-da-da. And as opposed to if we go back to spherical, right? So you can see all this blah, 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 and then we got anamorphic in here. Now, the anamorphic information, as far as the squeeze itself and all that fun stuff, will depend on a lot of things. I don't really know every single element of all of this. I've done a lot of experimentations to get things to work right. But I just leave this as type. Projection will be rectilinear, where we want to have perfect straight perspective lines. And distortion, we're going to use Nuke X Classic. I have experimented with Cara VR, or not Cara VR, because that's more of VR type stuff. But 3D Equalizer, which again has a couple of different equations and so forth. A couple of them are anamorphic. I found that they work okay. But I find that the same thing is going on. Now here's where you feed the computer the fact of what your aspect ratio is. Most of Hollywood's been working in 2x squeeze for, since the 50s and 60s. But now with all these goofy 16:9, trying to get that anamorphic look, it's weird. We're in an age where we're trying to recreate flaws. We're trying to recreate something that is retro, that was actually built because it was flawed. Anamorphic came around in the 50s to 60s in competition of television to get widescreen on the big screen. It was a big pain in the rear end. They were using it, and then when the 80s came around, they were switching back because of television and the 16:9 aspect ratio and all that stuff, back to spherical lenses. And they were using spherical lenses after that. And again, anamorphic and spherical were used side by side, or some not side by side, but on different shoots, different films, I should say. So here we are trying to recreate something that was originally meant to, basically get people in the theaters, and it was a flawed system. Okay, so I usually just leave it as radial standard and all this stuff. And you're going to come over here with the keyframes. Now, I'm going to put this to input. And you can see we have a total of, I'll go ahead and play it through, like 28 frames in this process. So we are going to track every single one of these frames. So I'm going to put the steps to 1, and we will say key all. And that's going to give a key for every single frame. And again, this is a 3-step process. We do the key all, we do the detect, set to grids, and we say detect. It's going to go through each and every single frame and try to track the contrast points here with the keeping in mind the computer is assuming that it's looking for squares. So it's going to draw that out on sort of a grid pattern as we kind of move through it. There it is. So I'll bring down exposure down. You can see it's kind of established the grid pattern through this process. And again, it's a little bit odd because we're dealing with asymmetry here. Again, this is, while all of this is going on, you can right click and say ignore pixel aspect ratio, and it's still doing the same thing from a non-squished version mathematically. So you always got to keep that in mind. You're really just previewing this with a squash, okay? The real reality is this is what's going on. So again, and remember, even though this is a quote-unquote 20mm lens, with the crop factor of the Blackmagic being, you know, what is it, like 1.9 or whatever, your 20 is going to turn into a 40 basically. But ultimately what gets, the actual camera that gets rendered will probably be something around a 20mm lens. But really with the crop factor, this comes out to about 40mm with the Blackmagic. All right, so we have all this set up. Just, again, leave all this information. It's going to get eventually filled. All this stuff is going to be filled up. The center, the denomination S, and all this fun stuff. And you also notice there's denomination S, and then there's denomination X and Y. So it's almost like a secondary, you know, you think of primary, secondary, tertiary, you know, deformation. This is the primary. And then the center is just where the center of the actual distortion is coming from. Sometimes it could be offset by just slightly a little bit. Every lens is imperfect. That's why you have to shoot your checkerboard with that specific lens. And probably while the adapter's on would be a good idea, because obviously when you put that anamorphic adapter on, if you turn it just ever so slightly left or right, you're going to get a skew distortion. So you want to make sure that is taken into account as well. So let's go ahead and hit the solve button now that we have done this, and click the button. Now it's going to take a couple seconds here, but eventually you're going to get a solve, and because we have this set to undistort, we will get a undistorted plate. So I'm just going to give us a couple seconds to calculate. It's going to take a little time, but it's important that you don't just have one still image of your distortion. It's important that you have a series of stills for your movement. That's why I move the camera in and I move the camera out, because I'm going to get all the contrast points over time throughout the process, and that's going to help undistort the plate. So now you can see something that, if I go ahead and bring it down, right, has a flattened version. Now you'll notice it looks as if the camera is pointing down. See that? We're getting a wider reality up here and a not so wide reality down here. And that's because when we filmed this, I had the camera slightly tilted down in regards to being what it should have been, which is perpendicular to the actual wall. So because of that, there's going to be a lot more squishing and squashing on both ends to distort the footage that's either the CG coming from Maya or the render coming out of the scanline render node. Okay, so now that we have this sort of matte, we want to make sure that it's actually correct. And I can just look at it. I can hit the letter Q to hide the overlays. And what I usually like to do is just put a roto node right after this. Turn on overlays again and just make sure I'm just selecting the roto node. And I like to just do a quick test here. I'll take one point and make a linear line and see if this is lining up. Okay. So I'll go across here like that, and then I'll just click off. So what you get, if I kind of full frame this, is you want to look for any distortion that's not established yet. And you can see, you're going to find this weirdness along the edges mostly, not so much in the center of the frame. But you can see even right here, if I put this point like right here, if I put this point like way over here, you can see this line still has a bowed reality to it. See it? There's still slight, ever so slight, bowed reality. And then even checking this area right here, so I'll just try to find a frame where I get a couple of, let's see here, probably like this frame right here. And I'll take this point. Again, some of this is motion blurred, which again, when I film it, I should have just had a high shutter rate. But with a high shutter rate, you're going to want to have a lot more light. So I was limited in that aspect. But you can see there is still, if I bring the exposure down here, you can still see there's a slight information bow still happening there. Now I'm going to go in forward lessons how we can go forth and create another distortion workflow, adding another lens distortion node to kind of undistort this. That's 2 hits on the sampling though. You got to keep that in mind. As you do any sort of sampling, like in this lens distortion node, you are filtering it through, in this case, a cubic workflow, which is slightly blurring the image a little bit. So you can see if I kind of take a look, if I go to filter, let's go to, I don't know, let's go to keys or something, you'll see that certain aspects will be sharper or slightly blurrier. It's a little bit of a hit. Sometimes people add a little bit of sharpening on the CG after all is said and done so that it kind of restrains back the edges. But again, you get some sharp artifacts or black artifacts around the heavy contrasted areas of your CG. That's why everything is done in subtleties and very small amounts. So anyway, I think we're pretty confident in to say that this is definitely something that we can use for what we're doing now. And I got more advanced training coming too as I kind of workflow through this. Again, we are not using atypical, whatever you call them, just anamorphic lenses by whatever major studio. This is all anamorphic adapter stuff that I'm showing you here. But somewhat, to a certain degree, this would be the, you would have a whole match move department that would probably take care of all this for you. As a compositor, you're probably not going to be dealing with this sort of stuff. But if you are some guy that wants to just experiment anamorphic, this is a perfect opportunity. Okay, so I'm going to take this lens distortion information and plug it through, and now you can see what it's done to my plate. Okay, so you can kind of take a look. There is information that's been stretched way out as far as like way out here, so you can see it's really, really, really heavily stretched. If anything, more horizontally than vertically. See that? There's not much horizontal stretch, but there is a lot of I'm sorry, there's not a lot of vertical stretch, but there's a lot of horizontal stretch. See that? If I disable and re-enable this. So there is missing information over here, but if we kind of take a look at our shot now, what we used to have, which was these curved pillars, is now straightened out. Now again, you could even look at this pillar and say, yeah, it doesn't look perfect, but it's close enough. And again, I'm going to talk about how we can deal with fixing these issues a little bit later. This is a very conservative shot. I mean, if you kind of take a look at it, it's really, I'll put this to input here. You can see I kept it very simple. I made sure there was square type imagery in the background so I can use some model builder node stuff. It's very simple, quiet. It's not shaky. The camera doesn't do a lot of panning or whip panning left or right. It's pretty conservative in its motions. Okay, so now that we have this lens distortion node, you're going to probably wonder, well, we'll probably just do this, right? We'll just track the footage. No, we are actually going to feed this information into the camera tracker. So I'm going to put my properties bin to 2. I'm going to double-click the camera tracker node, which is going to be plugged into my footage, and double-click the lens distortion node. I'm going to put my viewer to the camera tracker node, and what I'm going to do is take the information in. So camera tracker node, let's talk about this. We're probably going to have to create a roto node to isolate out Rev here. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull him out of the frame here, like that. And I'm going to just animate him, because obviously anything that's moving, whether it be shadow or reflections or persons, you want to mask those out. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. So you can see I'm just kind of moving through the shot and just doing some basic keyframe animation. I'm going to take the camera tracker node and we'll go over here to mask, and we will choose mask input alpha. And we'll use it free camera, lens distortion. We're going to choose unknown lens, okay? And we'll say undistort input, because that's going to basically undistort the footage for us. This here is actually linked right here, by the way. If you go to settings, if you go to output, this, if you have this unchecked, it's going to be unchecked here. If you check it here, it's actually going to be unchecked. So it's basically the same button. You can turn it on either way, but I'm going to leave this on. So what this means is I'm going to feed the actual camera tracker the lens distortion information, which will help it in its solve. Okay, it's going to know what it started with and what it ended with as far as what the computer thought is distortion. Now the focal length, I'm going to do approximate constant. I'm going to use it as unknown constant. That means that it's a fixed focal length. I could come in here and put in 20 millimeter. But the reality is that this footage has been so zoomed in, right, from the previous that it kind of went from a 20 millimeter to almost like a 16 millimeter because the footage has been so stretched out. So once you undistort the plate, you're actually changing the millimeter lens to a certain degree because it can be either zoomed in or zoomed out. It could be wider or longer. So again, you're fiddling with it. And again, I prefer, you could put approximate constant after you find out what the computer solves and put it in here. I will just use unknown constant for now, let the computer figure it out. Now, because of that, it's not advisable to have any visual effects shots that don't allow the computer to track the edge of information. So if you're trying to do this and you're basically only have like 10% of the frame to track because there's 5 people walking by or something, not a good idea. The computer is going to use the tracked information, the contrast points along the edges to establish and figure out the lens for you. And if you do put in like approximate constant and put in the millimeter lens, which in this case would have been 20 millimeter in our case, you're actually the computer's going to be fighting against you because you're kind of telling it, no, it's this direction, and because of the distortion, it's going to try to figure it out, and it's going to give you a bad solve. So I usually do pretty much unknown constant for now, which is, again, you're winging it, right? Film back size, again, this is going to be specific to the Blackmagic Pocket 4K at this specific shooting, which is 4096 by 2160. The Pocket Cinema camera at UHD actually just captures the center of the frame here, which has a different actual millimeter sensor size, which I'll talk about that in a coming lesson. So again, all you got to do is Google search. And here's the information that came up. You can see it's 18.96 by 10. So we'll just push that in. I should have memorized this by now. And you want to make sure this is correct, by the way, because this will actually establish your crop factor. The sensor is relatively small in the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. Very similar or comparable to the GH5, which is very close to a 1.9 or 2.0 kind of crop factor. So again, if we have a 20, eventually we're going to get what looks like a 40 millimeter lens. Okay, so at this point we are probably ready to track, but before we do that, we want to walk over to settings and turn on preview features. We obviously want to track more points, so I want to put this up to like probably 250. And there we go. Let's go with 300, like that. And take the detection threshold, bring it down a little bit. You can see it's masking out. It's not actually tracking rev because of our mask. So I'm going to turn this off, and we're going to come over here. Actually, before we track, let's go over here to our setup, and we forgot to add our lens distortion information. So I'm going to take my camera tracker node, lens distortion information. We're going to copy that information over here. All right. So again, I got these two available. You'll notice when it comes to the camera tracker under the scene itself, let's go over here to this. We have our undistorted input on, and we want to type in information. Now, if you turn on anamorphic, I'll just show you, it opens the door to the anamorphic squeeze and the asymmetrical distortion, which if you wanted to, by using the checkerboard, you can kind of make final adjustments using these two variables here, okay? But the radial distortion, we talked about this in the previous lessons, is pretty much right here. So this denominator S, we can go ahead and copy it, put that into the radial distortion 1, right? And then we can come over here to the denominator, whatever this is, and copy and paste that here. Distortion center, obviously over here is the distortion center. So I just double click and copy. It's going to offset the footage by ever so slightly to what is according to the imperfect lens's center. There we go. And we're going to put 1.33 squeeze in here. Now, what you could do before you officially track is you can connect this to the actual footage here, and if you still see this sort of like just, you know, kind of curviness along the edges, you can make adjustments here with this. So if I put this, like, put a value of like 0.2 in here, you can see it's squeezing it out like that vertically. So it's only doing it from left to right. See that? So I can also put this to 0.1, and now I'm squishing it like this in the corner. Now keep an idea. You can see what's happening here. It's sort of like a linear type squish to a certain degree, but it's additional information. So I can come in here and maybe help the computer out and stretch this, I don't know, maybe just a little bit. So if I feel like, you don't want to get too crazy with this. You'll start to get S curves in this, so you got to be careful. So here's the before, which is a negative 0.01. That's the before. So again, if I just put a negative 0.01, I'm kind of trying to pull out those edges. So I could probably do like a 0.03. That might help it out a little bit. Again, I'll just put this just before back. This lens distortion now can say bye-bye. I don't need it anymore. I can take this, I'll just put it off the side so you guys can see what solve it came. All this information when the solve happens is going to change. I want you to be aware of that. So as we kind of go through this and hit the solve button, all of this will get updated because the computer's going to try to use this information and create it. And then all of our redistortion and lens distortion stuff will come from this node. So I'm going to come over here. Finally, I'll do clear tracks because I had tracked it earlier. And now that the distortion's been added, and you know it's been added because you can see if I come over here to the undistorted input, it's taken that information that I gave the computer and it's undistorting it. Okay, so now we can track the footage, and I want you to see that it's actually physically tracking information that's sitting outside of the frame. Because even though it's sort of like a stretched canvas out here, the information out here is still useful for tracking because it's whatever is out here can still be used to establish the millimeter lens, okay? And because of that reality, your chances are you are not going to get an eventual camera that'll be what we had on set, which was a 20 millimeter Lumix. You're going to get something that's going to probably be like 16 millimeter because it's reading the information on the outside here, and it's applying that information to the camera solve. So again, this is kind of, we're entering into a little bit of a voodoo area here. And I have a feeling these equations will work a lot better, especially the lens distortion will work better if you're a rich man or you're working for rich people who can afford very expensive anamorphic lenses that were specifically designed to work well with these equations. Because these equations, the anamorphic equations in the camera tracking and the lens distortion were built around real lenses that existed or have existed for many years. So when you're dealing in my situation with this quasi-weird voodoo anamorphic where you're taking a spherical lens and recording a anamorphic lens, it's just going to be like crazy land. So thankfully, with a little bit of work, it still works. I find that Nuke always seems to find a way of getting something to work without having to resort to going to 3D Equalizer or some third-party tracking and footage redistortion program or whatever. So anyways, you can see we're just kind of tracking backwards. We have a full spectrum here. We are actually tracking the sky, which sometimes is a no-no. Some people like to kind of cut that out because that could start fiddling with the parallax of the foreground that the computer's trying to establish. Those clouds are significantly further out. So sometimes, besides masking out Rev, I would have also masked out the sky to avoid the computer trying to solve for the sky as well. But again, not a big deal. All right, so we have amber tracks in here. At this point, we can go ahead and do a solve, and the camera's going to try to figure out the actual millimeter lens. And there we go. Now, notice the distortion changed a little bit there. See that? If we go over here to our settings for our output, you'll see the values are not the same as to what we had previously. Okay, so be aware of that as you're kind of looking at this, kind of like, what happened here? So you can see this was like 0.08. Let's take a look at this original node. And you can see right here that the value is different. So the original was 0.074. And I go back here. This is now 0.08. Okay. So again, just be aware of that. So we have amber tracks, which obviously are tracks that were not included in the solve. We have green tracks, which means good solve data. Then we have these red tracks, which tell us that they're actually hurting the solve, being kind of like low quality tracks. So we can always just assess from here how well of the solve was. The error per frame rate is 1.8. It's common that this should be somewhere around 1.0 or lower. So you could come over here if you wish and start calling these by holding down Control under Auto Tracks of Max Error. Hold down Control and click on Error Max. And first off, let's get rid of the unsolved amber tracks. So you could say delete unsolved and hit OK. And those are going to go bye-bye. And then we have all these other tracks in here that, you know, if you want to, you could actually get rid of some of these just by deleting some of these sky tracks throughout the shot, because they could get in the way of your solve. So you might want to just go in here and knock out some of these puppies, you know, if you're like, okay. And I don't know if that's actually something, is actually capturing that edge there. I don't know. So I'll just go ahead and get rid of that too. And also, speaking of other tracks in here, like for instance, this red track right here, you know, you could just go ahead and say delete rejected, which are below this level. So anything, if you take this max error, you take this, you're going to eventually call all of these to red, but anything above this is going to register as red as far as the error rate, and you're going to cut anything above this limbo bar. So again, I talked about this numerous times. I'm going to go ahead and put this somewhere. Let's go ahead and back up so I can see what's getting called here. And you can see if I take the max error, probably, oh, I don't know, maybe something like that's probably good. And I'll say delete rejected, so anything in red is going to go bye-bye. And now we can come over here and say update solve. And hopefully we'll get a lower error rate than what we're having here. So I'll go ahead, OK. And give it some time. And it looks like our error rate's at 1.4 now. So again, it's pretty good, whatever you want to say. Let's go ahead and pump out the camera and see what the camera tracker registered as the camera. So we'll come over here and we will export out a scene. So I'm going to go ahead and say create. And what we have is we have a camera with a millimeter lens of roughly 16 millimeter. Now, we know with the crop factor, it's going to be somewhere around, you know, with this crop factor of the aperture or the sensor size being 1896 by 10, it should have registered somewhere around 20 millimeter, okay? But for some reason, it's captured it at 16 millimeter. Trust me when I say it'll still work fine. It's probably because it's taking in the outside information of the frame that we tracked earlier. So a lot of these tracks back here might give it the illusion that it is. I'm not 100% sure on this. If there's other people out there who would like to help out on this, I could just tell you what I'm kind of learning through this process. There is a possibility that if you want to just, you know, use this node, or maybe even take the information that you've acquired here, replug it into this node, put it here, and then retrack with a fresh camera tracker node where it actually crops off this information and it doesn't physically track the outside information. That's another avenue to travel, but again, I've had some really good success in the route I'm showing you right now. So again, you can see we just kind of look at this, And again, I don't have any ground. I don't have anything on here that's specifically the ground. But I could probably take this point here and select it and say set to origin. And at that point, let's go ahead and take a look at what we got. So I'm going to put my grab my camera tracker, hit the number 1, alphanumeric 1, take the scene node, alphanumeric 2, and there is our scene. So again, you can see that if I default to the camera, lock to the camera, put this as scene 1, stack over camera tracker, you can see that this is what we're getting. Now, I'm going to try to use, go back and hit number 3 on my camera tracker node and see if I can establish an up and down line here for the Y. So I can select these 2 points by shift selecting them and say set the Y direction. And then I could take maybe this point and say set the, I don't know, either the Z or the X. I'll choose Z. So now if I go ahead and take a look, put this to the viewer, now you can see that these are somewhat lined up to a certain degree. Alright, so let's see what we got. Now we obviously our rotation is off, and you can see this using the Z, X, and C nodes. You can see that the building itself, if we go to the side view, is kind of off. And again, the way I do this is I use the Z, X, and C node to look at the different side, top, and front views. And I go back to the camera tracker node, and I just use rotate. So I might start to fiddle with this, and you could sense it when you rotate it. So if I rotate this in the Y, I can sense that there's a wall of the buildings right here, and the points will come to a very distinct straight line. They'll overlap all the points. You can see over here it's too much, over here it's too little, but if I rotate it like that, and now I can use the rotate Z, and it'll start feeling correct. And then this maybe a little bit, and this is where you switch to other views. I definitely like using the top view. It really helps as far as the Z and the X, which have to work together. You can see if I do this, it just feels like I can sense there's a wall and all the points start to align in one specific line when I rotate the X. You guys see that? So here it is. Too much wavered on one side, too much wavered on this side, but on the middle, it's right on the money. And then I use the Z. I can rotate the Z, and again, if I rotate the Z, I want to jump into a different axis here. So I'm going to come over here, there we go, and then start fiddling with the Z. Again, I can't really judge it from here, so I think it's, there we go, this axis, and I could take the Z and start rotating it. And probably looking at something like that, I'm guessing. I don't know. Just go to your different views, play around a little bit, and then of course finally go to your 3D view and lock to it, and then you'll start to see that it is lining up. See that? In this case, I probably need to adjust my Z a little bit. Or yeah, there we go. So you can see, there we go. So now we have a decent alignment in the real world space of our scene, so everything is aligned correctly. And let's go ahead and just take a look at it. Again, you really want to play this through, so you can go ahead and hit play and just let it cache, obviously. And I'm pretty confident, because I've done this before as a kind of a practice take, that this is actually going to be perfectly fine. You could also take your resolution down to 2 over here. That'll speed the process up, even to 4 if you wish. And that's going to give you a quick cache of 4 times lower resolution of your 4K plate, which is a bit insane. But you can see that, you know, very, very quickly, as soon as this caches, we get a live feed. That looks pretty solid, like I said. Now, that doesn't mean that there's going to be weirdness along these edges here, where I talked about where we have maybe a possible still slight curve on some geometry. But for what it is, it's a great, you know, it's going to work in this case, in this scenario, as far as alignment, it's going to work really good with the stuff in the center here, since this shot doesn't pan around too much. But these areas might be a little bit tricky. Again, I'm going to show you better techniques to do tracking and lens distortion, undistort workflow. But again, you have an actual solve, right? So at this point in time, we can do what we usually do, which is create a model builder node. and we plug in the camera. We plug in the source. I'm sorry, the source will be the camera tracker node. And we'll put our viewer to it. We're going to get out of this stacked mode. I'm looking through the model builder node. I'm going to look in the camera and lock to the camera, otherwise this will not work. I'm going to also turn off the grid for now because I don't want to look at it. And I'm going to draw out a card. So I'll just draw out a card. And in this circumstance, I'm going to, and I'm currently in alignment mode, as you can see here. And I'm just going to align this. So I'm going to come over here and put this over here and over here. Sometimes working at this 4:1 aspect or 4:1 lower resolution actually works better for alignment mode because it kind of blurs everything and helps you kind of look at a kind of a blurred version of things. Like I talked about before, when the purple and the yellow align, that usually tells you the computer's telling you you're doing the right thing. So it's kind of wanting you to be like right there. And right here is fine. But don't always trust those 2 points. Okay, don't be like, oh, I gotta follow those points. And then just, now that we've done that, we're gonna triangulate the workflow by going as many frames away as we can without seeing the full frame of what we stretched. Take 1 point, drag it back to where it should be, drag this point, and that's it. So I might do one more third key here. Just a little bit of, just kind of take it and just move it up and down a little bit, and it'll kind of like start to snap to view like that. Like that. So now we have a solid piece. And you can see from the top, from the views, it's pretty solid. You know, we might have to rotate in the Z direction or something, maybe by a degree, and the X by a degree, but in general, it's looking pretty straight on. So one of the tests to see if, you know, your camera solved correctly is to try to get 2 cards at 2 different 90-degree angles. So another possibility here is to make one more card over here, which I'm going to take my resolution back to 1:1. And I'm going to draw out another card, which, if it allows me to, let's make sure everything is correct here. Lock to the camera, there we go. And I'm going to draw out this, and I'm going to bring my exposure up because this is like a DPX sequence, so there is a lot of information there. So I just drag this over here. Something that I know is a square in real life, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and just get that right there. This one has been a little tricky though. So what I've done is I've expanded it to go as high as this. And again, this might be slightly beveled in down this window, but that's okay. And then I'm going to just move a couple frames forward as farthest as I can. As far as I can, I should say. And just start to realign these as best I can. There we go. Okay, so if I look at the top view, you can see that I don't think it's perfect yet. I probably can just take this and physically rotate it. So I mean, if you wanted to go to edit mode here, I can right click and say vertices, grab them, hold down control and just rotate it like that slightly, just to cheat a little bit. But if you see a heavy amount where it feels like it's angled, that could mean that your millimeter lens isn't correct. The camera didn't solve for the proper millimeter lens. So you might get a bowing or kind of like a splaying of the actual workflow here. But in general, if I were to look at this now through the camera, through the footage again by putting my alphanumeric 1 to camera tracker and then my alphanumeric number 2 to scene, use my good old stack mode, again scene over camera tracker, and I'll bring the exposure up just a little bit, lock to the camera, make sure I'm looking through the camera, lock to the camera, and then again I'll put this to maybe 2:1 and just play it through and see how it looks. It looks pretty good. You know, so that tells me that the solve worked really well. I could export this out through a right geo node into Maya. The whole workflow of Maya will be a little bit odd because there'll be the issue of overscan, there'll be the issue of the asymmetry or the pixel aspect ratio squeeze, so we'll be discussing that as we kind of move forward when we get to our other examples. But this is kind of like just getting your feet wet and feeling it out. All right, so before we end this, we're going to do the good old scanline render node, which everybody loves. And we're going to put in the OBJ. I'm going to take the model builder node. I'm going to take these two cards, select them, and I'm going to bake out the selected geometry. I'm also going to create a checkerboard and plug that in there. And I'll bring my checkerboard size pretty big. So I'll bring this up like this. And the scanline, it'll be the object I render. The camera I will render with will be this. And if I take a look at it, I have rendered out some goodies. We will just go ahead and turn on anti-aliasing the medium. We'll come to our shutter samples, set that up to 2 so that we actually get motion blur. And we're also going to come back to the camera tracker node, export out a redistort node. So we go to the camera tracker node, you want to export out a distortion node, hit create, and there she is. And we'll pop her out with Shift Control X. And we're going to have to take this CG and distort it. Now, if you play this through, you might get some weirdness like a stretched line or something. If that becomes the case, you can go to add pixels to like 100 or something, and you won't get this sort of weird banding artifact that will render it out. So let me just push this back. So now you can see we have a nice cool solve, and it looks really good. We go ahead and merge this from this to the, this is basically the CG for A for a top. B for background is the original footage that is basically undistorted, or has distortion, I should say. And let's go ahead and see how that looks. There it is. Okay, and I'll just put the merge down like by 50% or something. And now we can go ahead and just cache this through and just take a look and see what we got. You can see the curve has been reintroduced. You will probably need to do overscan if you have objects along the edge, so don't forget that in your scanline render, it's probably a good idea to overscan by 250 pixels if you wish, so that you're rendering, maybe even a bit less than that. But if something comes off to the side, it has to render it and then squish it in. So again, just make sure that the those two elements are good. So let's go ahead and hit render or hit play. And it looks like we have a pretty good solve and a camera that's ready to export to Maya if need be. And then if you wanted to, you know, there's so many things you can do with this. Think about it, gang. You can come in here and replace these neon signs with Blade Runner-esque backgrounds, have a couple of ships flying around the background. You could have a couple of set extension buildings in the background, maybe dystopic buildings. There's so much you can kind of layer in here. You could have robots walking around on the ground. This is a shot that's, again, for you guys to, you know, through supporting the site, obviously, to use for whatever you want for your reels. I don't care. Again, it's just a really cool workflow. I love Anamorphic. It's just a lot of fun and so forth. So I hope this has been enjoyable for you. And again, we got more lessons coming and so forth. So see you then.